Shannon. He's a writer and a blogger who has published under a pseudonym. It's a big secret. He works for an insurance company and lives here in St. Charles with his wife and 2 children who appear to be here tonight. Patrick, come on up.
This is from a short story called The Relic Thief, which was published in the magazine Commonweal about a year ago. The year is 1962, the place is the west side of Chicago, and the protagonist is a boy named Paul who's about 12 years old. Although Italians were officially despised by the grown-ups in Paul's Irish family, everyone seemed to have at least one Italian best friend. His grandmother Jane, in fact, had 2. Olivetta, a spinster, was Grandma's cemetery friend. When she was 3, her father had been killed in an industrial accident. He drowned after he fell into a great giant vat of chocolate at the cocoa bar factory. Paul's mother told him one day as she dipped a Christmas cookie into her scotch. He was chopped up by the machine. At the wake, he could smell the nougat through the closed coffin. The poor man's wife had never forgiven him such a ridiculous death, but made the best of it in traditional Italian style and became a perpetual widow, keeping the rooms darkened and a black crepe-bedecked, startled-looking portrait of her husband over the fireplace. Such was the home environment of little Olivetta, who grew up to carry the somber darkness of her house in a tight-lipped and dignified manner. Where Grandma Jane's hobby was going to wakes, Olivetta's was going to the cemetery. After finding each other amidst the incense mist of a first Saturday sorrowful Mother Novena, the 2 quickly realized how much they stood to expand each other's horizons. Olivetta taught Grandma Jane how to decorate a grave, brushing aside her feeble clumps of faded petunias and mums, and soon Grandpa's grave was a veritable Amazon basin of jade plants, African violets, and baby's breath. In return, Grandma Jane taught Olivetta the finer points of wake going. Whereas Olivetta's prior practice had been to walk in, greet the family, kneel at the coffin for a silent prayer, then step out of the way, Grandma Jane showed her how to press the hand of the corpse firmly in one zone, while semi-audibly mumbling the prayer, a technique that not only conveyed a greater level of sincerity, but also instilled a stronger feeling of participation in the event. Olivetta was squeamish at first, but soon she began to enjoy herself. She also secretly fancied that she might be able to meet men at the wakes. She'd been waiting for the right man now for almost 50 years, and remained convinced that it was just a matter of time. Grandma Jane's other Italian friend was Julia, who lived down the hall in the apartment building. Julia was an entirely different kind of Italian from Olivetta, which she herself attributed to being from Sicily, whereas Olivetta was an uptight northerner from Naples. A widow, Julia was earthy, energetic, and superstitious. If she had a headache, she taped a holy card to her forehead. And the rosary she wore around her neck click-clacked as she maneuvered her 300-pound frame gracefully about, muttering incantations against Satan. Paul loved her apartment, a kind of monastic charnel house where saint pictures suffered in glorious full colors and saint statues writhed. His favorite, it hung over the kitchen table, was an almost life-size painting depicting what he thought of as Jesus inside out, a gory, bleeding, Sacred Heart Christ whose chest looked like it had been ripped open by a giant bird. Julia was forever spicing up Grandma's devotional life with statues of stone, flogged, and flailed saints sent by relatives from Sicily. "Gotcha, Saint Sebastian," she would say, unwrapping a plaster Technicolor saint whose face wore an expression of divine resignation at the 24 arrows sticking out of his body. Grandma accumulated a fair number of these statues over time and kept them on the top of an old dead radio console the family had used before the war, where they stood looking like the disoriented survivors of a plane crash. Paul loved this makeshift altar and would linger by it, hoping that God might one day speak to him through the radio. All this vivid Catholicism left its mark on Paul. At 12, he loved going with his grandmother to Mass and sit listening to the priest as he droned the sacred mysteries in Latin, and Grandma reviewed her massive collection of holy cards culled from countless wakes. In time, she gave him a few of her doubles to keep in his little missal, and he became an avid collector of holy cards the way other boys collected baseball cards. A group of pale boys from his parochial school shared his hobby. On occasion, this or that male adult in Paul's family would enter the living room and see the boys sitting on the carpet busily trading cards and would smile, until he noticed that the players on the cards were holding not bats but orbs and crosses, and wearing not Cubs or Dodgers caps but miters. One day, Paul's parents opened his bedroom door to discover him on his knees before a statue of the Infant of Prague, a rosary in his hand and 4 around his neck, a holy card taped to his forehead. They hastily closed the door, Paul's mother letting out a muffled sob. "Don't worry, honey," Paul's father offered by way of comfort. "We'll send him to a Jesuit school. That'll knock the religion out of him." Grandma thought Paul's piety a bit overdone, but Julia was delighted. She loaded him with gifts of rosaries and religious medals. Paul liked to put all of them on at the same time, and when he would march out into the living room wearing them, Paul's father would say with a sigh, "Here comes Father Super Pimp from the Vatican again." Though Julia was as enthusiastic about wakes as Grandma Jane, Jane avoided taking her because she tended to get sentimental and invariably ended up throwing herself on top of the deceased and wailing away, whether she had known them in life or not. Indeed, years later, at Paul's mother's wake, Julia would outdo herself by launching from the door of the mortuary chapel, racing down the aisle in a high-speed waddle, and slamming herself into Paul's mother's shoulder so forcefully that she dislodged the layers of padding used to build up the dead woman's emaciated body. This necessitated some discreet repair work by the undertaker, who, after a glance over to where a crowd of American Legion auxiliaries was consoling Julia by the holy card table, reached down, decisively grabbed Paul's mother's breasts and snapped them back into place, and then turned to an awed Paul and winked. As long as Paul could remember, he wanted a relic. No one in his family had one. Julia, of course, owned many and kept them in her bathroom medicine cabinet, the last place a relic thief would look, she explained. Her medicine cabinet had 3 shelves for the 3 classes of relics. First-class relics with their bit of bone or twist of hair gleaned from a saint went on top on the shelf of honor. In the middle went second-class relics, objects associated with saints like pieces of parchment from their Bibles or a square of cloth cut from their robes. The third shelf overflowed with third-class relics, which were objects that had physically touched the first-class relic. Julia's prized first-class relic was an actual bishop's thumb in a little golden box, the thumb of St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. A relic so powerful that Paul was allowed to look, but never to touch, no matter how hard he begged to. Why exactly can't you touch? Why aren't you allowed to touch a relic? What happens if you do? Julia raised her eyebrows. Anything could happen, she told him. Take my St. Christopher thumb, the one my sister sent from Sicily. She touched it, and she was never the same again. Well, what do you mean? What happened? Never you mind. Paul needed to find out what terrible story lay behind the thumb. And so he waited until a night when his father was relaxing in his easy chair and his mother sat at the dining room table with a tumbler of scotch. Taking a chair alongside, Paul asked her to tell him about Julia's sister and the thumb of St. Christopher. His mother clinked ice cubes in a glass. First of all, she began, keep in mind that Julia's sister is even crazier than Julia. Years ago, she got this idea that her family was descended from St. Christopher and she should have a relic. Where she lives in Palermo, there's a church with a lot of saints on display. They're all laid out in pretty coffins like dried sardines, including the one they claim is St. Christopher. Julia's sister had her eye on that saint for years, trying to figure out how she could take a piece off without anyone catching her. Not a nose or anything obvious, more like a fingernail. But there was a guard, and he watched her like a hawk. So one day, she's standing at the coffin and sees the guard all the way over on the other side of the church having some kind of argument with a tourist. On impulse, she bows down to the saint and bites off one of the thumbs from his playing hands. She bit it off? Paul asked, incredulous. You mean with her mouth? That's right. The problem is, the saint's been lying there for 1,000 years and the one thumb is stuck to the other. So now she finds herself with a mouthful of thumbs. And just as she reaches up to take them out, the guard shows up practically at her shoulder. So instead, she clenches her teeth together and goes and kneels in a pew. The guard gives her the gimlet eye and then walks over to a chair by the doorway. She's sure he's watching her. She doesn't know what to do, so she just keeps kneeling there. With the thumb still in her mouth? But what can she do? She can't very well go and put them back. She can't put them in her purse, now with the guard watching. She can't escape, because he's sitting right by the door. She can't even pray. Who's she going to pray to? St. Christopher? With his thumbs in her mouth? At any rate, for 2 hours she kneels there. At some point she sees the guard's head tip back and his hat fall off. Then he starts snoring. She gets up, genuflects, and walks out of the church with those things in her mouth. Only when she's outside does she spit them out, wrap them in a tissue, and put them in her purse. And since she ended up with 2, she sent the extra one to Julia. Paul's mother raised a skeptical eyebrow. Julia was very excited, as you can imagine, but I don't know if I could sleep at night if I knew I had a human thumb in my medicine cabinet. What about Julia's sister, Paul asked. Did anything happen to her? According to Julia, she's never been the same. From that day on, she stopped speaking right and started mumbling. Now she mumbles so bad, no one can understand a thing she says. She's as good as mute. I think it's her dentures, but Julia says it's from having St. Christopher in her mouth for 2 hours.